Chapter 2. We traveled separately to St. Louis, Uncle Bert driving a wagon loaded with what he deemed our most necessary tools and household items, while my cousins and I traveled by train with our trunks of clothes and bedding. At St. Louis, he planned to buy a second wagon and horse team and hire someone to drive it north with us. "Keep to yourselves," Uncle Bert said when he put us on the train. "If you keep to yourselves, nothing bad will happen." I looked at him in disbelief. The worst had already happened. "When you reach St. Louis, ask the conductor for the name of a respectable boarding house near the train station," he said. "Wait there. I'll find you." He estimated his trip with the wagon would take 4 to 7 days. "All will be well." "Don't be afraid," he said. "Don't worry about us," I said, trying to be cheerful because Mary Agnes was clinging to my hand. Full of sadness, I had no room for fear. We lived in a community where we knew every face, but now we were surrounded by strangers. At the start of our journey, we got lots of attention and offers of help from other passengers, ladies who gushed about my cousin's good behavior and fair beauty, and men who politely stepped out of the way to let us pass on the crowded platforms and in the narrow aisles. I thanked them as I watched my steps, lifting my head to smile at the women and being careful not to notice men who seemed to be studying me. On layovers, we sat, sometimes dozing in train station waiting rooms. By the second day, we were numb to the changing scenery, and our fellow passengers gave us little notice. Like us, they were worn down by the lack of rest and the endless rocking of the train cars on the tracks. I hadn't wanted to go, but by the time we reached St. Louis, I was grateful to be there at last. When I asked the conductor to recommend a boarding house nearby, he said, "Don't you girls go no place but to Mrs. Bond's." Already I felt more grown up, an experienced traveler. Obediently, I heeded his words, waiting with my cousins on the train platform while he told a porter where to take our luggage. "Come along," the porter said. "Directly there'll be rain." We hurried after him, across a street busy with clanging streetcars, wagons, and carts to a quieter side street. Without the conductor's recommendation and the assurance of the porter that, yes, this was Mrs. Bond's place, I would have looked for a house with cleaner windows and no peeling paint. When he stopped there, I said, "This is Mrs. Bond's house?" "She'll take care of you," the porter said, tipping his cap and leaving us and our trunks and cases on the narrow brick sidewalk. My cousins huddled close. "May Rose," Margaret said, looking anxiously at the shabby exterior. Mary Agnes clung to my hand. The house had no welcoming porch, just a stone step to a door. "This is what your father told us to do," I said. I rapped loudly on the door knocker because rain now pelted down. Right away, a woman threw open the door. "Ah!" she said, looking up and down the otherwise empty street. "Gosh a'mighty! Is you girls by yourselves? Get in here quick or you'll be soaked." She stood back, motioning us into a dim hallway. Our 2 trunks were still on the sidewalk. "Margaret," I said, setting down my valise, "let's get the trunks." "Don't worry about them things," the woman said. "Hector'll get 'em." She called, "Hector!" A boy who looked about Margaret's age rushed past us into the street and dragged a trunk up the step and through the doorway. We watched as he ran out for the second one. "Now then," she said. I drew myself up, trying to look older and wiser. "Are you Mrs. Bond?" She grinned widely. "So I am." Her face was pocked and sweaty, her pinned-up hair was coming loose, and her dress was faded and shapeless. I glanced past her at a dusty stairway. "The train conductor said this is a good place to stay." "Bless his heart, so it is," she said. "You pretty things got to be sisters. Is your folks coming?" "Pa will be here soon," Margaret said, looking suspiciously at the hall floor, which looked as gritty as the train we'd just left. We edged farther inside to make room for the second trunk, pushed by the boy, Hector. "All righty," Mrs. Bond said, giving each of us a smile of welcome. "Will one room do? I got one with a bed and a cot." When I said that room would be fine, she said, "I do my best to keep a respectable house, but we get all kinds of folks here, so keep your door locked, even when you're just going across the hall to the bathroom, and be sure to lock that door when you're in there. If you want a bath, take it in the middle of the day when there ain't so many here." With a frown, Margaret pleaded, "May Rose!" I could see Margaret wanted me to reject Mrs. Bond's house, but where would we go? Mrs. Bond seemed like a decent person, and Uncle Bert had told us to take the train conductor's recommendation. "I'll pay 1 day at a time," I said, "for we don't know how long we'll need to stay. I suppose we should see the room first." Hector closed the door against the rain, leaving us almost in darkness, and Mrs. Bond turned a switch, lighting a bare bulb at the top of the dusty stairway. "Hector, you bring one of them trunks while I show them the room and the bathroom," she said. "Perhaps we should leave the trunks where they are for the moment," I said. My directions seemed to please Margaret. "Sure enough," Mrs. Bond said. "You was brought up to be cautious, and that's a good thing, traveling alone and all. You come to the right place. I'll take proper good care of you girls." We followed her up the stairs, the boy ignoring my suggestion, dragging one of the trunks along behind us. "He's my sister's boy," Mrs. Bond said. "Strong, ain't he, for not being full-grown? Imagine the man he'll make." At the top of the stairs, she turned onto a hallway slightly brighter than the one downstairs, having a window at the end. "Your room's back here by the bathroom," she said, opening a door. "It's more handy, but the hall gets noisy at times, account of the bathroom, you know. Step in and see how nice it is." The room was a surprise, brighter and much cleaner than the hall downstairs. "I don't put just anybody in this room," she said. "No bachelors for sure, 'cause lots of them spits tobacco wherever suits them." Breathing an approving sigh, Margaret said, "It's very nice." The air in the room smelled a little stale, for its single window was closed, but there were yellow print curtains, a dresser with a wash bowl and pitcher, and a bedspread that looked clean. Hector pushed our trunk into the room, then hurried out to bring up the other. I agreed with Margaret. "This will do very well." "I knew it," Mrs. Bond said. "Have you ate?" I was more interested in a bath. She instructed me about cleaning the tub and said we would be the only guests at lunch, for the other lodgers were at work. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need me," she said. "If you want, you can eat at the late supper time with me and Hector." The other lodgers, she explained, were men, and they ate as soon as they came from work. The house was old and big, with sloping floors that creaked and a toilet that was slow to flush. But in the next few hours, I decided Uncle Bert had been wise to tell us to seek the advice of the train conductor, and the conductor had rightly sent us to Mrs. Bond. We'd been without a mothering influence for too long, and we were glad to have her direct us. The first day, we were happy to bathe and change into clean dresses, eat, and rest. Mary Agnes chattered to Mrs. Bond during a lunch of potatoes fried with bits of bacon, telling her about the school and friends she'd left. We'd already told her Uncle Bert was taking us to North Dakota. "I take it you're motherless," Mrs. Bond said. She smiled sympathetically when we nodded. "Well, it's clear you had a good bringing up." Water pooled in my eyes, for there's nothing more weakening than a sympathetic word when you've tried to be strong for a long time. On our second day, Mrs. Bond told us we should get out into fresh air, so in the morning we sat in her weedy backyard and took turns reading aloud from my copy of Evangeline. In the afternoon, Mrs. Bond suggested we take a walk, and she told us the streets where we could go and where we should not. Margaret kept watching for her father, saying he should be here by now, and what if something had happened? He'd planned to take the wagon overland to the river, then a flatboat down the Ohio and up the Mississippi. Margaret's anxious look didn't change when I reminded her he'd said we might have to wait days for him to catch up with us. When Mrs. Bond learned Uncle Bert didn't know in what boarding house we'd be, she sent Hector to all boarding houses in the vicinity of the train station with a message for Albert Johnson. "Now, wherever he lights, he'll know to come here," she said. By the third day, we were feeling restless but quite at home in Mrs. Bond's house, and she let us help her wash and put away the dishes and sit in the kitchen to pass the time. "Me and Hector is going to a barn social tonight," she said. "You girls should come along." I said, "All of us?" I glanced from Mary Agnes to Leola. I felt quite adult, but I didn't know if the social would be appropriate for my cousins. "All ages of kids goes," Mrs. Bond said. It's my cousin's barn, and he don't allow no liquor. I'll be your chaperone. We can take the streetcar to the end of the line, then we'll have to walk a bit." Of course we wanted to go. There'd been no socials for us through the years of Aunt Sweet's illness, for Uncle Bert was not interested in such things, and there'd been no question of going alone. The barn social changed my life. No one should have been surprised, for I was at an age when change is normal, but I was unprepared for its suddenness. At home in Ohio, my exposure to the world had been limited to events with no new or remarkable people. And though our train journey through Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois had put us in close quarters with hundreds of travelers, we'd been taught to speak only as necessary with strangers and never to look at them too much. That night, we looked at everyone, and everyone looked back. I felt transformed. Even as we approached the wide-open barn doors, my heart beat quicker, spurred by the music flowing out into the night. Inside, I felt immediately included in the frivolity, excited by the fast, sweet fiddle tune, caught up in the spectacle of whirling dancers and the thumping of feet in time to the strumming of the guitars. Little children hopped around, old ladies nodded and tapped their feet, while young and old bobbed and swayed and swung each other in circles till they were red in the face. I wanted to dance. So did everyone, whether they knew how or not. Someone grabbed my hand. "Let's dance." It was Hector. I glanced quickly at Mrs. Bond. I'd heard boys were supposed to say, "May I have this dance?" "Go and have fun," Mrs. Bond said, grabbing Mary Agnes's hands and swaying with her in the crowded area beside the dance floor. Hector's bold move surprised me because he and I had never spoken, though we often ate at the same table and passed frequently in the hall. I felt embarrassed, going onto the dance floor with a boy so much younger and shorter, but the purpose of a social was apparently to socialize, and I didn't know how to refuse. "This is going to be the Virginia Reel," he said, stopping at the end of a line of women and girls in the middle of the floor. "You stand here with the women. I'll be over there." He crossed a few paces to the line of men standing opposite their partners. The woman on my left said, "Howdy, are you having a good time?" "I don't know how to do this," I confessed. "That don't matter. Being last, you'll get to watch and see what everybody else does. Just step to the music and follow along. You'll like it." The fiddle started and one of the men in the band called out, "3 steps up and bow to your partner." The woman beside me tugged on my sleeve and I took 3 awkward steps and bowed to Hector. "Now, 3 steps back," the caller said, fitting his words in time to the strong beat of the music. I felt better, seeing a few others who hesitated, also new to the dance, but soon I was stepping and clapping, and there was a lot of laughing as a man or woman got turned around or tried to do the back-to-back with the wrong person. There was no stopping for mistakes. We just scrambled on. I clapped with a happy feeling as I watched the first couple step out and bend politely toward each other, a woman in white and a sandy-haired man in a blue checked shirt. While we stood in place and clapped, they linked their arms and swung, then left each other to swing the next man or woman in line. Then they danced back to swing together again. By the time they reached Hector and me, I knew to step forward and link my left arm with the man in the blue checked shirt. He was tall, his arm was strong, and his steps seemed more graceful than those of anyone else in the room. I didn't know then, but this was Jamie Long. Briefly, we swung, our left arms entwined, then he stepped away and swung his partner and I back to my place in line. He and his partner then galloped in side steps back to the head of the lines, and we all peeled off in opposite directions, coming together to pass under the first couple's bridge of hands. After that, the first couple took their new places at the ends of the lines, the sandy-haired man beside Hector and his partner beside me. The routine began again with a new first couple. 3 steps up and bow to your partner, the caller said. Breathing faster, I stepped forward with genuine pleasure, for though Hector was only a boy, he was a sprightly dancer, and I was having fun. When we all bowed, I saw the sandy-haired man smile, not at the partner before him, but at me. He had beautiful light brown eyes, the same color as his hair,